Hi everyone, Mr. Watts here, and today we're going to learn a little bit about habitat fragmentation. So our objective for this is I can describe how habitat fragmentation affects biodiversity and identify possible solutions. So as you're going through these notes, please use your guided notes. There's 3 guided note sheets that you will use, and you can tape those into your field journals when you're done. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. So first thing we need to think about is really what do organisms need to survive? And these are going to be the components of habitat. So in our first line where it says, what do organisms need to survive? Write down habitat. And these are the components of habitat. Most of them are listed here. All organisms need food, they need water, they need shelter, they need some space, and that could vary depending on what species they are. And we can consider arrangement. So within the space, how is the food, water, and shelter arranged in there? And that all plays a factor into the success of a species. And so here's the problem with habitats that are starting to decrease in size due to habitat destruction. As habitats are reduced or altered, there's more competition for the resources. So all of these resources, these requirements for a habitat, when the habitat gets smaller, competition increases. So it might reduce the number of individuals that can live there. And then kind of like in our lab, some may have to disperse somewhere else, some may outcompete, and some may end up dying. So this can result in a decrease in populations due to death or emigration or moving away. And that's that dispersal we talked about when we were simulating throwing those poker chips for our habitat fragmentation lab. Just a quick review, why is biodiversity important? You don't have to write anything down here. We talk about those 3 big measurements, and there needs to be a lot of variation in genetics. So our genetic diversity, some species diversity, and also our ecosystem diversity is important. Just to have a lot of differences in there is a general indicator of a healthy environment. And some other values here are ecosystem services, all those things that the ecosystem does to help out the environment, but they also play a factor in helping us. Intrinsic value, those are just the things we just enjoy having nature. So spiritual value, recreational value, our psychological well-being, just going outside and enjoying nature, and it makes us feel good. And then finally, economics. There's tons of things with economics, from food to medicine, biomimicry, raw materials, and even ecotourism, where people pay money to go and see, just to go and see and be in part of nature. Nothing to write here, but this is just a quick reminder of our big 6 threats to biodiversity. Habitat destruction, we're going to focus on fragmentation as part of habitat destruction. Invasive species are all those species that come in that aren't originally from the area. They outcompete the native species for the resources. Population or resource use growth. So as the human population increases, the amount of stuff we need, space and food and resources, has increased. Pollution definitely can have a factor. All the chemicals and pesticides and things that are put into the environment can kill organisms. Climate change, so the overall change in our weather patterns and our climate over time, which will allow for organisms to move and change their patterns and cause competition in areas as well. And then overexploitation is simply just taking too much, harvesting too many things. So that's a quick review of HIPCO. We should have that in our brains, of the 6 big threats to biodiversity, and know what each one of those are. All right, let's get to it. Habitat fragmentation. This is our first definition. It's kind of midway through your notes. Real simple. If you can see in this picture, we have our large area, and it has been divided into multiple smaller areas. It's fragmented. So the official definition here, habitat fragmentation is a process by which habitat loss results in the division of large continuous habitats into smaller, more isolated remnants. So really, we're taking a big habitat, turns into many small habitats. In the major causes here, there's kind of two things we can look at for our major causes. One are some large scale things, and this would be agriculture, city developments, things like that. And then some smaller scale things would just be like if they build a road through a forest, or they have pipeline access that they have to clear out some area for. It just ends up breaking up those continuous habitats in various ways. So there could be a whole city built, or a whole farm field that's put in, or it could be something small. And each of these are going to have an impact on organisms a little bit differently. So on your notes, it says draw a picture of habitat fragmentation. Just do something like this. Have a large scale, and then show that it goes into some smaller areas. So you can decide how you want that to look, but it should represent something similar to this picture. So take a minute and pause if you need to, and draw that picture. All right, moving on to our second page, you should see this diagram at the top of your note sheet. What should wildlife managers be concerned about fragmentation? Or should we say, why should they be concerned about fragmentation? I think I mixed up on my notes there, but there's a couple of 5 bullet points here. Is that if we notice, here's our original habitats, all intact, continuous. We can also tell the temperature over here, and we can see that it hasn't been fragmented. Here's what happens. One, it can leave habitat islands. So it really reduces the ability for organisms to interact with each other. That's pretty important for breeding, but it's also important for attaining those resources that are important for habitats. Blocks migration routes, so it makes it hard for things to move around. Think about this salamander crossing roads and things like that. That can be pretty challenging. They don't move very fast, but that also could be for larger organisms as well. Divides and isolates populations and reduces genetic diversity. We know that genetic diversity is important, and we don't want to have just a small gene pool within a population. We want to have a large gene pool that provides the opportunity for organisms to intermix. If we just have one kind of set of genes and there's not a lot of variation in the DNA, then it can be, especially if a virus comes through or some sort of a disease and there's nothing that's resistant to that, it could really wipe out a population. One, it inhibits or slows down migrations and colonizations, so it can kind of just slow down that process of organisms moving. Then a big one here, slows down they need food. And if there's not enough food in a particular area, they're going to have to spend more energy and more resources just to go out and find it. So those are just a couple of things of why this is important to think about if we want to maintain healthy populations of different species. And so this brings us to our next thing, which is called the edge effect. So we know that a habitat is fragmented, but now the fragments actually cause a little bit more trouble as well. And notice when we see what's happening on this habitat patch. So as habitats are broken down more in more pieces, we're going to see a larger area occupied by the edge of the habitat, just the outside boundary. So we're going to see this increase in percentage influenced by the edge effect. Notice here, our original patch, there's 30% is going to be edge. As it gets smaller, ends up being 43. 64% of this whole area is edge, and 88 when it's a really small area. So why is this important? It's called the edge effect. Here's what happens. Changes in populations or community structures that occur at the boundary of two habitats. This is what the edge is. So you can write down that definition. And here's the big thing. It decreases natural habitats and allows for invasive species. Remember, that's one of our HIPCO big threats to biodiversity. It allows for invasive species to populate the area. So they're going to continue to, the invasive species outcompete some of these native species for the resources they need for their habitat: food, water, shelter, space in their arrangement. So their space is getting decreased. So consider this, all this brown around the outside, this kind of light brown color, that's bad. I want you to think about that just generally as being bad, and it's bad for what's on the inside. So as habitats get smaller, the area of the edge increases, and so there's more kind of bad pressure on those native habitats. Let's get to our solutions. So this is our last quick page of your notes. And one of the big solutions is called wildlife corridors. Corridor, I think of as like a hallway, essentially. And so you can jot down this definition real quick. A wildlife corridor is a link of wildlife habitat with generally native vegetation. Remember, native means that these are things that are normally found in the area, which joins two or more larger areas of similar wildlife habitat. So this is kind of some differences here. In our picture, we see here's our core habitat. Maybe these habitats have been fragmented. And so here's an example. There's kind of a one pathway. This one has multiple smaller pathways. This has many very small pathways. We can also see these aren't totally connected, but there's places that organisms can move. And this might have many kind of very small habitats in between. But this is why it's important. It's critical to maintain for the maintenance of the ecological processes. So kind of going back to that ecological ecosystem services values is important. I'll reread this. Corridors are critical for the maintenance of ecological processes, including allowing for the movement of animals and the continuation of viable populations. So we looked back on our previous page of notes, and we saw the example with the salamander where they are going to have trouble. So now if they have corridors to move in and out of these habitats, it's going to increase their ability to survive and reproduce, find resources they need, breed. So make sure you jot down those notes real quick. And then there's three types of habitats we're going to learn about. And right now I gave you all of these definitions, but we're going to draw a picture of each one of those inside of the right-hand column on your note sheet. But just listen first as we read through these and look at some examples. And then I got some examples you can look at to help you draw those pictures. So the three big things we're going to look at are strip corridors, stepping stone corridors, and then what we call a mosaic. So a strip corridor is linear or linear-like features that connect corridors between habitats such as hedges, strips. I want you to think of a corridor as kind of those hallways. They're long, continuous strips, strips of forest, vegetation that grows along the banks of a river. So all of this is going to be a corridor, this green right here, to help organisms move up and down this area. Stepping stone corridor are a series of small, non-connected habitats which are used to find shelter, food, or rest. So as organisms are moving, they might stop in this patch and eventually find their way to this area. There's also some other patches here. So stepping stones, kind of like little chunks of habitat along the way. And a mosaic is when you're designing a landscape, you might have a mix of both strip corridors and stepping stone corridors. So let's take a look at what each one of those are going to look like. So take a few minutes in your notes. You can pause on this if you want to, but kind of make these drawings. So it's really kind of strip corridor. We can go stepping stone, and then you can decide to make this says landscape mosaic. So you'll want to have a mix of stepping stone and strip corridors. Take a minute to do that. Now that you have that done, that comes to a conclusion for our quick notes on habitat fragmentation. Again, the big thing is this: habitats, when they're broken up, increases competition and reduces the ability for organisms to breed with each other and access the resources that they need for their habitat. And the big thing we can do as wildlife managers is to think about wildlife corridors as a way to connect those and solve that problem, while also maintaining all of the human needs of the area as well. So I hope you learned a little bit something on habitat fragmentation, edge effect, and the possible solutions for habitat fragmentation.